Kenya's President William Ruto has told police to shoot looters and arsonists in the leg. He's ordered officers to curb the ongoing anti-government protests that have seen some of the country's worst violence in years. Dozens have been killed in nationwide clashes between police and demonstrators. Weeks of protests were sparked by outrage over the death of a popular blogger who was in police custody. Tensions escalated further after a police officer was filmed fatally shooting a civilian at close range during a protest against police brutality. Ruto now says authorities should take a hard line against those he blames for the violence.
There are people who think they can sponsor violence in Kenya. They burnt properties the other day, looted supermarkets, destroyed people's properties, destroyed people's businesses. And there are leaders who are inciting these things, paying young people to go and burn people's businesses. Anyone going to set ablaze anyone's business and property, such a person should be shot in the leg, be taken to hospital and taken to court. They should not kill him, but break the leg so that they can go to the hospital and courts afterwards.
There's a stark message there. We're going to talk about that. I'm joined now by Nyanyala Nyanola, a Kenyan author and political analyst. She is in Edinburgh, Scotland tonight. It's good to have you on the program. We just heard President Ruto there. What do you make of the government's response to these protests?
I think that it was a very ill-advised statement. I think it's very important to pay attention to the fact that it was a statement that was made in Kiswahili and not in English, which is the second official language of the country. And that is really an attempt to speak directly to Kenyans in a language that he doesn't believe that people will understand outside the immediate context and will hold him accountable for. This is a very dangerous escalation. It is a call for police brutality, which is the very thing that people have been out in the streets protesting. So
if I could, let me just pick up on the point about the language thing. So you think that the president used the language to circumvent public criticism? I mean, is he trying to hide what he's saying?
International criticism. I think it's a political choice that a lot of senior Kenyan politicians make when they want to separate themselves from international scrutiny. Keep in mind that Ruto was just in Europe earlier this week. He was in France, where he met with President Macron, and he was in the UK. And this is a very huge departure from the rhetoric that he was using when he was speaking to the leaders of these countries. So there's an element there of trying to separate himself from accountability, from his comments, from visibility for the things that he's saying, from international scrutiny, if you will, for the things that he's saying. And in this particular case, this is a very significant escalation against peaceful protesters, because what he's calling for really is police brutality. The
president has warned of regime change. How much potential is there for these protests to morph into a coup? What do you think?
I think it's very difficult for a leaderless movement to get to the point where it can pose threat to an elected government. I think that's just a universal truth. This is a leaderless movement, a wave of discontent that has arisen from very specific socioeconomic and political conditions. The most significant escalating factor that we've seen, and this is a cycle of protest that really goes back to last year in the anti-finance bill protests, is first of all an intolerance for dissent, an intolerance for listening and using the established constitutional mechanisms for listening to the people, whether that is ignoring submissions that are made in Parliament, ignoring submissions that are made to the legislature, and then ignoring what protests are calling for. So I think this is a leaderless movement that is arising out of a very specific moment and is not really looking for regime change, but is looking to be heard by an executive that, on the other hand, is making it clear that they have no interest in listening to what the people have to say, that has forced through unpopular fiscal measures, that has forced through unpopular political measures, that continues to use disproportionate force against peaceful protesters and against young people specifically, who were the constituency that Ruto courted when he he was running for office. So he made promises to these young people that he would offer a broad-based and inclusive government. And it is that frustration and that disappointment that is leading to these cycles of calls for protests and calls for people to go out and march. And so I think that there's a deliberate effort here to mischaracterize what's happening in the country in order to justify the disproportionate use of force. Really, if there was just allowed people to protest peacefully and allowed for the constitutional mechanisms for public participation, for engaging the legislative process to run as they were designed constitutionally, you wouldn't see this particular push. I
want to let our viewers know, too, back in 2018, you published a book entitled Digital Democracy, Analog Politics, How the Internet Era is Transforming Politics in Kenya. And that brings us to the constituencies you were talking about, young people in Kenya. What role does the Internet, social media, what role do they play in these protests?
I think it's been a space where people are able to speak to each other directly and are able to circumvent some of the sort of strictures that exist within traditional media, which is legacy media in Kenya is owned by political families and has shown historically bias. Censorship is very common. We saw, for example, during this last round of protests that despite constitutional and measures that prohibited this and despite the intervention of the courts, the government did impose a temporary shutdown on broadcasts because they didn't want people to broadcast what was happening in the protests. So I think what social media does is allows people to find each other, and it allows people to speak to each other directly outside of these constraints that exist within the legacy media. I think it also allows for people to speak to each other creatively. And this was one of the really interesting things that emerged out of the June 25th protests from last year, was that completely unprompted and completely unorganized, these young people translated the provisions of the finance bill into multiple local languages, disseminated this on various social media platforms, and that became a form of civic engagement and a form of civic education that just wasn't possible with any of the institutional civil society groups that exist. And these are the kind of things that social media makes possible. It's obviously complicated by the fact that these platforms are owned by American, mostly by American companies. And so now in this moment that these platforms are having with the American political space, that also brings complications for Kenyan users.
Nyala and Yanola, we appreciate your time. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but a fascinating discussion. Thank you very much.
Welcome to AfriFreedomChannel, your home for fearless, fact-based political commentary rooted in the African reality. The political temperature in Kenya is rising rapidly, and the latest statements from Irungu Kang'ata have only added more fuel to the fire. The Murang'a senator, once a key ally of President William Ruto, has now publicly disowned the administration, labeling it heartless and declaring that they will make Kasongo a one-term president. But what does it?
Sisi kama wa Kenya wote, kuanzia Turkana mpaka Mombasa hadi Garissa, sisi watu ambao wametoka hii eneo la Mlima Kenya, sisi watu wa Murang'a, tumekasirika sana kuuliwa kwa Boniface. Tumekasirika. Sisi kama watu ambao wametoka hii eneo, tuna demand justice for Boniface Kariuki. Huyu kijana hakuna makosa alikuwa amekosea mtu. Alikuwa anafanya kazi ya kung'ang'ana Nairobi. Tuliona video yake na hakuwa amebeba silaha. Tunaona ya kwamba serikali inakosea vijana hawa naitwa Gen Z. Na reason ni kwamba huyu kijana yeye ni mojawapo wa wale ambao serikali ilikuwa suppose inalinda. Hawa vijana kama hawa, they do not deserve to die. They deserve to be protected by the government of Kenya. This government must take responsibility for the death of Boni. We demand justice, and we tell the government that we shall not rest until Boni gets justice.
It means when a prominent figure like Kang'ata, who once stood on the front lines of the Ruto campaign, now regrets that very decision. What has pushed leaders like Kang'ata to such a turning point? Could this be the beginning of a political reckoning within Kenya Kwanza? And more importantly, what does this say about the direction in which the country is heading? Do you think the people will forgive a regime that's increasingly viewed as betraying its own citizens? Let us know in the comments. Perhaps the most painful part of Kang'ata's statement was his emotional tribute to Boniface Kariuki, a young Kenyan allegedly lost at the hands of the state. "We will never forgive them for killing our son," he said, with a fire that echoed through the hearts of grieving families and enraged citizens alike. This is no longer about politics, it is about the soul of a nation. Why are young people being sacrificed at the altar of political expediency? Is there any future for a country that fails to protect its youth? Comment below what justice looks like for Boniface Kariuki and others like him. Meanwhile, an ominous post has begun circulating widely. The world watches Ruto in awe. It's a statement soaked in irony. While international observers express shock at the unfolding crisis, Ruto's government seems unmoved by the pain on the ground. With a global spotlight on Kenya, the pressure is mounting. But pressure can either burst pipes or forge diamonds. Will this pressure force accountability, or will the state continue down a dangerous path of denial and defiance? Do you believe international attention can help save Kenya's democracy? Or is it simply a spectacle for the world while Kenyans suffer in silence? The silence from other high-ranking officials is equally telling. As the streets swell with voices crying for change, many leaders have chosen comfort over conscience. But Kang'ata's defection may not be isolated. Could this signal the early cracks of collapse from within Kenya Kwanza itself? And if the ruling coalition begins to fall apart, who will step forward to rebuild the nation, and at what cost? Will the people trust politicians again, or will this pain give birth to an entirely new wave of leadership from the grassroots? Kenya stands at a crossroads. The betrayal of trust, the cries of bereaved families, and the crumbling faith in leadership are shaping a new narrative, one not written by politicians, but by the people themselves. At AfriFreedomChannel, we will continue to amplify those voices, hold power to account, and ask the difficult questions that mainstream platforms avoid. Stay tuned, stay engaged, and above all, stay awake. The future of Africa depends on the courage of those who refuse to be silent. Never forget, your voice is your power. Use it to shape the freedom you deserve.